What's up, everybody? Today I'm taking a look at the Asus TUF Gaming RX 6800 XT. Now, this card comes in here at $800, which is $100 more than the comparable RTX 3080 TUF Gaming. This is the OC model, and it also puts it about $150 more than the reference card. So today I'm going to be comparing it with an XC3 RTX 3080 from EVGA, and then the reference AMD RX 6900 XT. And I'm going to be looking at both of these cards, stock and overclocked, as well as the 3080. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the 3080 on hand because, I traded it for the 6900 XT. So with that being said, first things first, this card is just absolutely massive. Comparing it here to the reference card, you can clearly see where some of that additional money is going. Like, there's just no comparison. This is probably the largest card I've ever seen. There seems to be a competition among these AIB manufacturers of who can make the biggest card. And this one isn't even the largest. We are seeing 4-slot cards now. This one is 2.5, but it's extremely wide. It barely fits in my Lian Li PCO11. Other than that, I think the aesthetic is pretty nice. It's just, it's comically large, honestly. Definitely make sure it'll fit in your case if you're going to buy one of these. We still have 2 dual 8-pin power connectors on it. Overall, I think the aesthetics are pretty nice. It's full metal, just like the reference card. You could do without the tire marks on the back, but I mean, it's fine. You get dual BIOS. Everything in this video was done in the P mode, which is the performance mode. As far as display outputs, we have 3 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI, compared to 2 DisplayPort and 1 USB-C on the reference card. Now, with this massive cooler, I was really expecting this card to run virtually silent. So that kind of brings up the next point. Even though this thing is absolutely massive and just completely dwarfs the reference card, I found that the overall cooling is actually worse. Funny enough. So not only do you have to deal with trying to fit this thing into your case, but you're also doing it at the expense of having a worse cooler. So to test this, I fired up Shadow of the Tomb Raider and let both of these cards, the 6900 XT and the 6800 XT, just sit on the main menu, both overclocked. The 6900 XT actually draws a little bit more power, so it's automatically at a disadvantage here. And I just let them run for 15 minutes. Both of these cards sit at basically max load just on the main menu. And after 15 minutes, I found that the 6800 XT was sitting at around 72 degrees Celsius, whereas the 6900 XT was sitting about 70, just a couple degrees cooler. But then again, this cooler itself is way smaller. And I think the biggest reason for that is that the reference card is using a vapor chamber design, whereas the Asus model seems to be more of a conventional heatsink. Now, Asus hasn't exactly had the best reputation for making AMD cards. So far, this one seems to be pretty good. I haven't had any massive thermal issues and all that. Leaving the card stock, my temps were mainly in the upper 60s, which is fine. And that's 4K gaming, so basically maxing out the card full time. Several of my previous cards have been Asus Strix models on the NVIDIA side. They tend to make really good NVIDIA cards. It's good to kind of see that they're putting a little bit of effort into their AMD lineup this time. So compared to the reference card, I'm assuming you get a slightly upgraded VRM, but I haven't torn off the cooler and haven't dug too much into that. You do get a slightly higher power limit, and again, this is the OC edition, so out of the box performance should be a little bit better. For overclocking these, I used the more power tool and then moved my slider around until I got the best possible overclock. So both of these cards, the 6900 XT and 6800 XT, I configured with the same power options. So both of these cards should have been allowed to draw 380 watts, and I can say it made a much larger difference on the 6900 XT. That seems to be much more power limited than the 6800. The 6800 wasn't using the full power allowed to it, so it clearly was not power limited. And either I got the world's, won the Silicon Lottery with the 6900 XT and just got a complete dud with the 6800 XT, but yeah, my overall overclocking results weren't super great for the 6800 XT. I ran a couple benchmarks at 2.6 gigahertz, and then unfortunately had to back it down to 2560 and then 2120 on the memory. It just wasn't stable above that. which is kind of unfortunate and kind of low. I got really good overclocking results with the 6900 XT, being able to overclock it to 2.77 gigahertz. Yeah, that just wasn't possible. And I do want to note that on the 6800 XT, AMD does have an artificial 2.8 gigahertz clock limit. You can't go above that, which is really unfortunate, especially since my 6900 XT can basically hit that on air. So that is kind of unfortunate. But moving on to the full system specs, I'm running an AMD Ryzen 9 5900X with PBO on, and SAM is enabled as well. That's cooled by a custom loop on an Asus Crosshair 8 Hero Wi-Fi motherboard. I'm running 48 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 megahertz RAM with a pretty terrible cache latency of CL22, and then a 1000 watt EVGA G2 power supply. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and just jump right into the benchmarks. Okay, so you've seen the results now, and if you've noticed, I only tested 4K and 1440p, and the main reasoning for doing this is I found that 1080p is just too CPU bottlenecked. All of these cards perform very similarly at 1080p, and really, you could probably save some cash if you're playing at this resolution and getting a either a 6800 or a 3070. So, looking at the 4K results, performance was near identical to the 3080. These two cards were neck and neck. So with the card stock, it was about 2% slower than the 3080, and that's including the RT titles. And then with the overclock, it moved to about 1.6% faster. At the end of the day, I would call these a negligible difference. Like, these cards are basically exactly on par with one another. And then if you take out ray tracing, it actually moves to 1% faster stock and then 5% faster with overclock. My 3080 also did not overclock at all, but I think the 30 series cards in general have a little bit less headroom than these new Radeons. So that ends up giving us about a 7.6% increase in performance with the OC. Relative to the 6900, that's about 9% slower. Both cards overclocked. So pretty, I don't want to say significant, but there is a difference there. And then the Forza was definitely the biggest win for the 6800 XT relative to the 3080. Moving on to 1440p, there's not much to say. The results were almost nearly identical. Both cards, again, neck and neck. Unfortunately, though, this time it was unable to beat the RTX 3080 even with the OC. I think some of these titles are slightly CPU limited here. But yeah, both of these cards, very competitive. It's excellent to see competition at the high end again. The 6800 XT versus the RTX 3080. The 6900 XT here just seems to be in a league of its own, thanks to the overclock. Moving on to the conclusion, this was just meant to be a really quick video kind of highlighting the performance of this card and sort of my initial thoughts. I'm really not sure who this card is for. At $800, I personally would not buy one, especially if there's a cheaper, exactly the same comparable RTX 3080. At $700. It just doesn't make sense to spend more on this card than the 3080 in my opinion. You get more features with the 3080, whether it be DLSS, which that's a conversation of its own. I kind of spoke to that a little bit about that in my 6900 XT review. DLSS, Ansel, you name it, RTX voice. There's so many NVIDIA softwares out there. It's kind of up to you to decide what they're worth to you. More than likely, there's probably at least one that you care about. But yeah, I mean, both cards, the 3080 and the 6800 XT, are ultimately really good choices. And as of right now, it kind of comes down to which one can you find in stock. But even comparing this to the reference 6800 XT, I really don't see why you would want to buy this one at $800. The cooler, it's massive, but I've already shown it's not any better than the reference cooler, which is significantly smaller and cheaper. At $650, I think there's more of an argument to be made for the 6800 XT, and that it's cheaper than the RTX 3080. And this is coming from someone, if you watch my other video, I actually do recommend the 6900 XT. I thought it was a good upgrade from my 3080. But this card here, not helped in any way by its poor overclocking performance, it's really hard to justify. I think $800 is just too much for 6800 XT. Even my XC3 RTX 3080 came in under it at $760. That was an XC3 Ultra. So it's really hard to say like who exactly this card is for. If the price came down, it'd be very easy to recommend. But for now, I'm going to say you should probably save your money and go with a reference card or wait for some of the AIB models to come down in price. But that's going to wrap it up for this one, guys. Thank you for watching.